So, and in the prospectus or the agenda, it says that the title of my presentation is My Grandmother's Garden. And the actual full title of the presentation is My Grandmother's Garden on the Incommensurabilities of Decolonization for Afro-Indigenous Futurities. And when I crafted it, I intended it to be simple and clear. And I thought that it would, now I realize it lacked an explanation and it probably invited confusion about where it fits in the whole scheme of things. So I'm thankful to the organizers for being patient and indulging that lack of clarity, which is an inherent part of the work for me. So some of the things I know about placing myself in this work. My name is Charlotte Henay. My mother was named Naomi Louise Black, and my grandmother was named Elizabeth Jane Arana. My great-grandmother was named Rosette Agnes Minns, and her mother was known as Janie Cox. And I name my ancestors and offer you those names because I call them into this space as I recognize the peoples who have been in relationship with these spaces since before its occupation. And I don't know if you did this at the beginning of the conference, but this territory is currently held in treaty by the Mississauga of New Credit. However, before that contemporary negotiation of territoriality and who owns the space, it was a space of three fires confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, also the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat Nation, and the Métis Nation. And I'm not immediately responsible to it, as I'm not a member of any of these communities, but it is governed by the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon, and it binds those keepers in relationship to each other and to this place, space, and time. As my mother's daughter, I access what she lived as one body through Afro-Indigenous processes of meaning-making. And specifically, I sit with her bones and in my grandmother's garden, and hence the title of my presentation. My stories begin with these places, spaces, and times. A big part of my work is subverting the Academy's expectations that we be able to quantify, or attempting to subvert the Academy's expectations, that we be able to quantify, qualify, and define the work that we do, ourselves and our memories, and dissect our knowings in this process. Scholarly pursuits have often been predicated upon this separation. So I find that in this exercise that's called the PhD, and as a PhD student, there's an abiding temptation to trifle with the sublime. We name and we rename things, we examine and we make contributions, we critique and we assemble, and only occasionally and awkwardly do we embrace chaos. Yet for me, I see chaos as residing at the heart of Afro-Indigenous futurities, chaos and witness. When I speak about witness, I mean a number of things. Witness, testimony to both the grossly visible and the hidden atrocities of our lives, the sacred responsibility of refusing to look away, rememory, to recount and to reimagine, witness as ceremony, and also what we do here, which is witnessing each other's lives, writing and performing our own stories. I want to contribute to reshaping how we think about in-between spaces, a space that I live in, including the Academy, as we bear witness and recenter protocols of rememory and storytelling as spaces of possibility. It's not a quest for certainties, rather it's a striving to create consciousness, more than a third space, futurities that are predicated on relationships of imagining. And My Grandmother's Garden is the title of a poem I wrote about living in the in-between. Her garden lies in between times, identities, lands, and spaces. Was it a settler's garden? Was it an Indigenous practice of resurgence and relationship? Was it a slave garden? Was it a portal between multiverses? Narcisse Blood theorized land as time, space, and place, and Leroy Littlebear, who's a Kainai or Blackfoot scholar, theorizes time as nonlinear. And Ola spoke about time as moving through past, present, future in a continuum and not a straight process. And Leroy Littlebear talks about time as ancestors only ever being 2 days away. Jackie Alexander also talks about this in Pedagogy of Crossing, and Michelle Wright in her Physics of Blackness. I wrote this poem in thinking about notions of hybridity, creolization, indigeneity, and Black Indianness, specifically in the Caribbean, and what it means to be at the interstices of Blackness and indigeneity in this geopolitical space, as well as in diaspora. How do we think about settler and indigeneity as categories? Who's a settler, who's Indigenous, to what space, when, and according to whom? What about belonging in what is being labeled a post-humanist, post-identitarian, and post-racial society? I begin to dissect these stories, my grandmother's, my mother's, and now my own, at specific moments that came together and were instigated most recently by a course that I studied on Black Indianness. And the historicizing of original relationships, some of which were pre-colonial, but are represented as post-colonial, and the intentional obfuscation of Black and Indigenous peoples' relatedness in colonial history, or the misrepresentation of this relatedness. I believe that only in the journey back is there any coherence in the what comes next to the work of living into this story. The discourse of Indigenous extinction in the Caribbean is insidious, it's powerful, and it's thriving. My own thoughts and ancestral connections are scattered across continents and generations. So I collect these stories and I bring them together in a method that's chaotic, and I find its expression only in poetry. I'm thinking about how we collectivize our stories, some which are secrets, and the imaginaries that this collectivizing may offer for remembering a different future. When I speak of becoming, I'm thinking of it as an ongoing living into, non-linear, non-hierarchical understandings of time, relationships, and processes, as opposed to a fixation on origins. It's rather about connections and relations. So here's the poem. My Grandmother's Garden. Endlessly self-renewing, thinkings, doings, what do my dreams mean? Even that seems obscured by the self-control I must be lacking. Recalcitrant, reluctant, remiss, resurgent, restitutive, restorative, don't figure in the disciplines that I am expected to master. The way we were and are, is there no desacralizing? The wind blows tunnels through my memories and haunts my disconnection. I remember I was supposed to talk to other Indians, except we passed each other unrecognizing and ashamed, disciplined and diminished by the demands. My not radical enough friend asks me if I've seen her mother. Suicide visits me in unnamed spirits on this borrowed deck. I don't know much about being or becoming. I know about the depth of never enough. It crawls into your belly, meant to be there-ness, hiding it for almost as long as you can remember. I know about believing I don't have anything of any consequence to say. Maybe you know this believing. Despite papers I have written, speeches I have given, I know about not making a difference. After all, I don't really exist. Today we theorize the politics of revolution, apathy, brown, black babies, mothers, as long as I can't remember and they are not my own. Resocializing and re-educating ourselves, tired, frightened, look away. Fast, fast, paddles hit water quick before the monster eats you. That man, he knows about water too. Cliff jumping shorts playing black and white across my forehead, sapodilla drops fruit in my bed, tied up in someone else's dreams. How far must you have gone before you remember your own dead? Get up, child. No time now for gardens underground. I can't get hibiscus to bloom here. What do I do with this longing for my own soil, ephemeral return to a land I never left? There is a myth that orchids are inordinately fragile, susceptible to the smallest shock, exotic. Grandma said they were tough and best left alone aside from some selective pruning, sovereign. They know their own earth, enjoy partnerships, symbiosis, syncretism, hybridity, words they may be familiar with, having survived exportation, transplantation, artificial cultivation, and resale. I am come lately to their care, have found frank conversation helpful. They respond to our language, sing-song tones early in the morning, remind me with echoes of Grammy's chiding, other mothers' remonstrances. I've found they don't do as well inside here. There isn't much else, save for those few months a year. Perhaps the climate has also contributed to their vitamin D deficiency. Washing them out, passing for fragile instead of deprived. Muffled screams, anguished and indignant at overzealous cutting, impatient redirection of roots into wood chips, charcoal remnants of incendiary deforestation. Forgive them. It's inexplicable after all. Farming bones, marrow sucked out for fertilizer. Every flower needs its time in the dark. Reveling in salt coat dulled shimmer of their flesh, holding breath and thought in case of new growth. Miraculous every time they return. Hardy, insatiable, hunger for daylight draws them groaning out from beneath. See them turn their faces up to their sisters and gossip about the neighbors, while the trees celebrate their children, luring them into the dawn. Fragile finds no purchase here. It is reserved for arid reproductions requiring close examination to establish they are for real. This paper piece addresses my concern with the seeming incommensurability of Afro-Indigenous futures and decolonizing projects in academia. I position myself at the center of what Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, in the piece they wrote, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, call settler-native-slave relationships and their legacies. I'm interested in talking about the paradoxes of Indigenous decolonization and futurities. I don't see them as forcibly complementary or cooperative. I do this with story work. I'm wanting to reframe strategies of representation, negotiating the boundaries of identity and indigeneity in a multiracial space, from inside the myth of non-presence of indigenousness in the Caribbean. I'm rethinking how Blackness and indigeneity might be imagined and felt in the future in confronting issues of hybridity and diaspora through a lens of personal experience and feminist theorizations in colonization. I posit that the challenges negotiated by Black and Indigenous subjects in the present offer a starting place for relationships of imagining that aren't immersed in a collective culture of amnesia. This collective amnesia underwrites both Black nation-state politics and heteropatriarchal neo-colonial narratives of Indigenous resurgence, allowing us to forget how Blackness and indigeneity became, when, and where. Rememory is integral to this poetics. In creating our own theory to hold our iterations of ourselves, relationships of imagining recenter Black and Indigenous women as leaders and collaboratively creating new futurities. In telling Caribbean stories of becoming, poetry is both theory and tool. I've thought about what scholar and activist Leanne Simpson situates as resurgence flowing out of Indigenous knowledges, at the same time as she, and this is a quote, interrogates race, sexuality, and gender as key power arenas of the settler state which disconnects our peoples from land. The question of land is an interesting question. The question of territoriality, the ownership of land, how we put claim to it, and how we historicize Afro-Indigenous experiences inside of that context. I struggle with the concept of decolonization as repatriation or rematriation of land and territoriality, and what that implies for who we conceptualize as settlers and how we understand complicity with ongoing colonization without recognizing the imbrication, what I see as the inseparableness or inseparableness of, I'm a PhD student, I make up words, of Blackness and indigeneity and the ongoing experience of settler colonialism for Black bodies and in Black spaces. So in this time and space that I'm theorizing, the hyphen is viscous. It's a sort of restoration between people, between ideas, between one person's knowing and another's. This in-between voice finds some foundation in experiences, or rather it's motivated by experiences of anti-Blackness I had at an Indigenous leadership forum at UVic in 2013, where I was interested in talking about the imbrication of Black and Indigenous futurities and settler colonial experiences, or rather experiences with settler colonialism. And there was a distinct strategic essentialization of indigeneity, sovereignty, and nationhood as related to territoriality, which I found very troubling. And that combined with the experiences that I had in the context of the Black Indians course, as well as, I don't know if you're familiar with the old article that was written by Ina Dua and Benita Lawrence about decolonizing anti-racism in 2005, where Black folks were positioned as settlers. There's since been a lot of unpacking of that, but I think that there's an underlying question of how Black bodies are complicit in ongoing settler colonialism that we need to problematize in the context of resurgence. So, I see Black liberation movements and Indigenous resurgence as inherently intersectional, mutually imbricated and inseparable as such. Indigenous resurgence movements draw a great deal on Black nationhood genealogies, what Robin Kelly calls Black freedom dreams, Fanon's notions of decolonization, négritude, Black feminist questionings of theory, without necessarily recognizing how those fit into an ongoing strategic essentialism around indigeneity in this geopolitical space, as well as in the Caribbean. So, am I out of time? 2 minutes. Living and embodying resurgence, remembering and restoring, my work is a series of ongoing conversations with my mother, ones that I could only have with her death, after her death. These conversations serve as both barometer and compendium. But they're not all of the work. The conversations with my mother are a metaphor for unpacking the silences that exist in our communities and in our families around Blackness, indigeneity, and settler colonial spaces and how we occupy those, as well as alliances and solidarity. I insist on the stories of living in the in-between, inhabiting becoming as an experience across space, place, and time, and taking up space in the future with what Audra Simpson refers to as death as the catalyst for activism. I think it's important that we ask, in restoring and researching our memories, individual and collective, what terms exist for this work. What are the tensions that exist between Black and Indigenous communities and peoples, and how do these tensions impact solidarities? What do memory and presence look, feel, and sound like envisioning Afro-Indigenous futurities? And can decolonizing research and practice seek Afro-Indigenous futurities? And I specifically say Afro-Indigenous futurities because we hear a lot about Indigenous futurisms, and we hear a lot about Afrofuturism, but we don't hear about Afro-Indigenous futurities and how we might craft this remembering of futurities together. This poetics of witness complicates alliances promoted as agential in resettling the political agenda of our times. In examining the politics of allyship and solidarity and decolonizing for Afro-Indigenous futures, I think that rebalancing the settler-native enslaved relationship is key.